I wrote a letter to my husband, then tore it to pieces. Not out of anger, but because I realized I no longer needed his attention to feel like I existed. I'm Eleanor, almost 40, a quiet wife, a devoted mother, until my son Caleb took me away from the city to a small lakeside town where the gentle sunlight and leaf-strewn streets reminded me that I was once a woman with dreams. Have you ever lived so long for others that you forgot who you were? Tell me your story, because maybe your awakening began with a moment just as small as mine did. Mornings in the seaside town often begin with the gentle sound of waves and the distant calls of seagulls echoing between pale sails far off in the mist. Eleanor woke as she did every day, not because of an alarm, but because the soft gray light outside her window brushed against her eyelids. The sea breeze slipped through the cracks of the door, drifting into the small kitchen where she would quietly brew a cup of green tea, gazing out at the saltbush garden that had begun to change color from the ocean's salt. She was about to turn 40. Not exactly old, but no longer young in the way the world defines vibrancy. Andrew, her husband, was a busy man, constantly traveling between cities for meetings. Eleanor had long since stopped keeping track of. Caleb, their only son, had just turned 21, a boy who'd grown so fast, she wasn't sure she could still keep up. This morning was no different. Andrew sent a message saying he'd be away for another 3 days. Caleb ate his breakfast in silence, then slung his backpack over his shoulder and left, as he usually did, and once again, she was alone, with the quiet stillness of the White House by the sea. Eleanor used to believe her life was peaceful, but lately that peace carried with it a kind of emptiness she couldn't quite name. She wasn't sad, she wasn't angry, but she didn't feel truly present anywhere either. As if she were a shadow passing lightly through each room, tidying up, preparing dinner, watering the plants, then vanishing in the very space she once called home. She sat on the porch, staring out toward the ocean, where the horizon blurred into the mist. Her eyes no longer searched with excitement, only observed quietly, out of habit. A part of her had once loved this beach, had once dreamed of opening a small tea shop on the corner where women like her could come and talk about things no one ever asked. But the years had taught Eleanor how to tuck those dreams away, neatly, without bothering anyone. Only lately, she had started to wonder, has anyone ever truly seen me? Not as Andrew's wife or Caleb's mother, but as herself. Eleanor, the woman who once wrote diary entries on wet sand, who once knew the scent of sun-warmed tablecloths, who once laughed alone when she came across a line of writing so beautiful it ached. And just as she was quietly navigating that feeling, Caleb stepped onto the porch, pulled out a chair, and sat beside her. "Mom," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "I've got 3 days off next week. How about we go somewhere just the two of us?" Eleanor turned, looking into her son's eyes. There was something in that gaze, sincere, gentle, unhurried, that kept her silent for a long moment. "Do you have somewhere in mind?" she asked softly. "Yeah, a little island off the southern coast. I interned there once. It's quiet, you'd like it." And in that moment, not from reason, but from a quiet voice inside her heart, Eleanor nodded. She didn't know what kind of journey she was about to begin, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir. Like the sound of waves crashing against a cliff, not rushed, not loud, just a gentle call. It's time to come back to yourself. Eleanor sat by the window of the small ferry, her finger tracing absent-minded circles on the fogged glass. In front of her, the ocean stretched out in a vast, endless blue, the crests of silver-tipped waves brushing gently against the side of the boat as if whispering something only the sea could understand. Caleb was standing out on the deck, his coat flapping in the sea breeze, his dark hair tousled by the wind, but his posture remained steady and calm. She had never imagined traveling somewhere far away with her son, not to visit relatives, not for work or duty, simply to go. Because her son had invited her, and she had no reason to say no. Or, more precisely, no longer had a reason to stay. The ferry docked in the early afternoon. The island was smaller than she had expected, just a row of wooden cottages nestled along the sandy shore. backed by tall, slender ferns swaying gently in the wind. The guest house they had rented was surrounded by whispering coconut trees, its porch draped in thick, dark green vines. Caleb carried the suitcase inside first, leaving her standing for a moment at the entrance, her heart softening under the strangely still presence of this place. "I thought you needed the quiet," Caleb said, turning back to her, his eyes gentle, as if reading all the words she hadn't spoken yet. They had dinner at a small beachside eatery, where warm yellow lights glowed over a simple table set with 2 plates of grilled fish, wild greens, and sticky rice wrapped in banana leaves. No city noise, no phone chimes. Just the sound of waves and the salty scent of the wind. "I remember when I was little," Caleb said as he placed some vegetables into her bowl, "you used to tell me fairy tales. But lately, you've stopped." Eleanor set her chopsticks down. "I thought you didn't need them anymore." He shook his head. "I've always needed something from you. Not the stories, but the way you used to live. You live with so much color, Mom. Do you know that?" She was silent. A feeling crept into her chest, warm and aching. How long had it been since someone last said they could see the colors in her? Not her roles, not her responsibilities, but her. The woman who once laughed for no reason, who once picked flowers simply because she liked them, who once felt deeply moved by a beautiful film. That night, Eleanor lay in an unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind rustling through the window. Caleb had fallen asleep early, his room lit only by the faint glow of a nightlight leaking through the crack in the door. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders, and sat down on the wooden steps. Before her, the sea stretched endlessly under the moonlight, the waves rising and falling like the steady breath of the earth itself. She closed her eyes. She wished for nothing, hoped for nothing. She simply allowed herself, for the first time in years, to feel her own presence, fully, not eclipsed by someone else, not waiting for someone to call her name. She sat there, just Eleanor. Not someone's wife, not someone's mother, but a woman breathing between sky and sea. And in that moment, Eleanor knew she had never been lost. She had simply forgotten the way back. But now her son, the one who once needed her the most, had reached out his hand and gently led her home. The next morning, Eleanor woke as the first light of day slipped through the white curtains, soft as a breath. The small wooden room was so quiet she could hear the shells clinking against each other on the beach and the slow sighing of the waves beneath a clear blue sky. Caleb had been up early. He stood on the porch, wearing a dark t-shirt, shorts, and a small backpack slung over one shoulder. When Eleanor stepped outside, he turned and smiled. "Do you want breakfast first or take a walk before we eat?" She paused briefly, then nodded. "Anywhere's fine, as long as you're walking with me." They began down a small trail leading into a forest of casuarina trees. The earth beneath their feet was soft, layered with fallen leaves, and the chirping of insects played like a gentle soundtrack to the morning. With every step, Eleanor felt like she was walking backward into the past, not to escape it, but to gather the fragments of what she had once let slip away. Caleb walked slowly to keep pace beside her. No phone, no earbuds, just his full presence. The way he occasionally tilted his head to ask, "Are you tired, Mom?" or quietly pushed branches aside for her to pass made Eleanor realize this was the first time in years she felt accompanied, not just followed. "When did you learn to be this gentle?" she asked, half teasing, half sincere. Caleb smiled without looking at her, his eyes still on the path ahead. "Probably, when I noticed you'd been silent for too long." A simple sentence, but it rang inside her like a bell touching something hollow. The clearing were stopped when they reached a clearing, where sunlight streamed through the canopy in beams, like cracks in a dream slowly unfolding. Caleb sat on a fallen log and patted the space beside him. Eleanor sat down slowly, shoes muddy, hair sticking to her forehead from sweat, but she didn't mind. She only felt real. "Did you know?" she said after a moment. "I once wanted to study contemporary dance." Caleb turned, eyes wide as if he had just discovered a secret door. "Really?" She nodded. "Back when I was in college, But then I met your father, then you came along, then we moved, and the years just went by. Caleb didn't say anything, but his eyes softened, as if he were gently wrapping his mother's unopened memory with both hands to keep it safe. You could still learn, he said quietly, not to perform, just to feel yourself moving again. Eleanor turned to look at her son. In that moment, amid trees, sunlight, and the breath of nature, she realized it wouldn't be someone young, extraordinary, or distant who would awaken her from her quiet years. It would be her son. The same boy who once clutched her fingers as he learned to walk, now gently showing her the path forward. And Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, smiled, a smile not meant for anyone else, but for herself. The woman slowly remembering how to live, not just survive. Afternoon on the island was as quiet as a page yet to be written. The sun sank slowly toward the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over everything. The tree branches, the doorstep, the porch roof, and even Eleanor's hair as she sat on the rattan chair in front of the cabin. Caleb was quietly sweeping dry leaves around the porch. He said nothing, letting the soft sweep of the broom against the stone floor tell its own story. Eleanor watched her son, her gaze softening with each of his steady movements. She suddenly remembered an afternoon more than 10 years ago, under the same golden light, at a similar small porch. Only then, Caleb had just begun to walk, and she had been preoccupied with Andrew's relentless phone calls from the office. Eleanor closed her eyes. In the dimming light of dusk, memories surfaced vividly like a folded painting. A half-finished meal, a vague reply, a hug postponed. The small things she once believed harmless, but which had quietly chipped away at her heart over the years. What are you thinking about? Caleb's voice came gently, but it cut through the flow of her thoughts. Eleanor opened her eyes, slightly startled. She gave a tired smile. I'm thinking about the things I missed, probably more than I ever dared to admit. Caleb sat down beside her and handed her a cup of warm ginger tea. The rising steam drifted up gently, like an invitation to be forgiven. I think, he said slowly, a lot of the time, we miss out because no one teaches us how to stop and live. They only teach us how to try harder. Eleanor looked at her son, her heart tightening. In Caleb's calm demeanor, she saw a part of herself. The part that had once naively believed that love meant sacrificing without needing to be seen. Have you ever, she asked softly, felt like I wasn't really there? Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned slightly, looking out toward the treetops bathed in the colors of sunset, then said quietly, I have. But I never blamed you. I just felt sad watching you disappear. A long silence settled between mother and son. Eleanor swallowed hard, her heart filled with gratitude and a deep ache. She had believed that keeping the family intact was enough, forgetting that emotional absence could leave the most invisible of losses. The sun fully slipped beyond the horizon, the sky turned a deep violet, and the first star had just appeared. Think, Eleanor whispered, as if to herself, it's time I learn how to truly be present. Caleb didn't say anything, only nodded, but in his eyes, Eleanor saw something she had long yearned for, trust, returning. And in the last light of the day, Eleanor felt something clearly for the first time. The past may not be repairable, but the present is always a chance to begin something kinder for herself and for the ones she loves. That night, the small wooden kitchen was warmed by the soft glow of the hanging light and the gentle bubbling of water in the teapot. Eleanor stood with her back to Caleb, her hands busy arranging slices of bread on a plate. But inside, she was arranging something else. Courage. I've been meaning to ask you, she began. What made you bring me here? Caleb, splitting firewood near the stove, paused. After a moment, he set the axe down. Silence returned, broken only by the occasional crackle of the burning wood. As I wanted you to have space to breathe, to remember who you are. Eleanor turned around, leaning lightly against the kitchen counter. The sea breeze slipped in through the cracks of the wooden door, carrying with it the unmistakable salt of the ocean. She looked at her son, no longer the naive little boy she once knew, but a young man with the features of both his mother and father. And yet, something uniquely his own in his eyes. I've known for a long time that you weren't okay, Caleb continued, his voice raspier than usual. But when I was little, I didn't know how to name it. I just knew every time you cleaned in silence, every time you said, I'm fine, something inside you had just broken. Eleanor swallowed hard. A wave of emotion rose in her throat, but she didn't want to interrupt her son. I didn't bring you here to heal you, Caleb said, but so you could see that you're still whole. You're still here. You haven't been forgotten. You don't have to disappear to keep anything together. A soft sob escaped Eleanor, and she lifted her hand to cover her mouth. Not out of shame, but because for the first time, someone had seen through the calm facade she had worn for so many years. You've really grown up, she said, eyes brimming with tears. I always thought I had to carry it all, that I was the only one holding this family together. Caleb stepped closer without saying a word. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, firmly. It wasn't a hug, just a steady hand, reminding her she wasn't alone, that she was no longer alone in the quiet fight against exhaustion. I want you to be fully yourself again. Eleanor, as you've always been, beneath it all. Hearing her name spoken aloud as her own person, Eleanor felt something awaken. She smiled through the tears. That night, in the wooden kitchen where steam rose from the teapot like unspoken truths, mother and son faced each other with unguarded honesty. And in that moment, Eleanor understood forgiveness isn't just something we give to others. Sometimes it's the first gift we must offer to ourselves. The next morning, Eleanor woke earlier than usual. Outside, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtain, casting a gentle golden hue on the old wooden floor of the room. A soft sea breeze drifted through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of salt and the crispness of early day. But what woke her wasn't the sound or the light, it was something else. A strange feeling of peace. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel the urge to immediately get out of bed and dive into a familiar chain of duties. No rush breakfast, no alarm clock, no husband's suggestive knock on the door after another late night. There was only her and herself. She slowly rose, slipped on an old sweater, and stepped out onto the front porch. Caleb was sitting on the steps, sketchbook and pencil in hand. The morning light caught his hair, forming a soft halo like a faint thread of memory. What are you drawing? Eleanor asked, her voice still touched by sleep. Caleb smiled and looked up. I was sketching you while you were reading. Eleanor was taken aback. She walked closer and glanced at the page. The lines were still unfinished, but the figure of a woman had already come into view. Eyes slightly sunken, yet bright, lips curved faintly as if holding back something unspoken. Hair falling gently across her cheek. She wasn't youthful, wasn't flawless, but she was there, fully present. I sketched you reading last night, Caleb said gently. You looked truly present, like yourself. Eleanor didn't know what to say. No one had ever drawn her. No one had ever looked at her as a whole person, not just a role. You still have that quiet light, the kind that stays, even after so long of not being allowed to be. Eleanor turned away, tears spilling unexpectedly, but this time she didn't hide. She didn't flinch. I used to think all I had left were the things already behind me, she said, voice trembling. That time had taken everything important from me. But this morning, looking at you, hearing what you said, I realized I never really stopped. I just forgot how to look at myself. Caleb placed his hand over hers silently. In that moment, beneath the morning light and the salty breeze of a peaceful coast, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. She was no longer the woman of should-haves and could-haves from the past. She was someone learning for the first time to live for herself, without regret, without hesitation, not waiting for someone to notice her, to finally allow herself to be. That afternoon, Eleanor retreated into the small room next to the back porch, a space where, over the years, she had unconsciously piled up old books, unfinished embroidery pieces, and a small wooden box she hadn't opened in a very long time. Caleb had gone for a walk along the rocky shore, leaving her some space of her own. In the quiet stillness, Eleanor sat down on the wooden floor and pulled the box toward her. The lid opened with a soft creak. Inside were yellowed sheets of paper, a draft of a book she had never finished, a map of a solo trip across Italy she once dreamed of taking in her youth, a few old Polaroid photos of her holding the first pastry she ever sold at a roadside bakery during her college years. It all felt like the faded breath of a version of Eleanor she had long forgotten existed. She turned each paper over slowly, as if tracing the thread of old emotions. One diary entry, written when she was 27, made her stop. One day, I'll wake up early not to make breakfast for anyone, but just to hear the waves. And I'll start learning French again just because I want to, not to please anyone. Eleanor smiled faintly. That passage was written in a youthful, hopeful script. She had once been so full of energy, with dreams that existed outside the boxes of devoted wife or exemplary mother. She once wanted to live a life full of color, depth, not just in step with someone else's rhythm. A dream that is never fulfilled doesn't truly vanish. It simply waits for a heart brave enough to turn back and face it. She took out a new, clean notebook. On the first page, Eleanor carefully wrote, I once disappeared into my roles, but I'm coming back, not to do something grand, but to live each small thing with all my honesty. She set the pen down and took a deep breath. Inside her chest, instead of the hollowness that had sat there for years, she felt something beginning to stir. An inspiration, a gentle current. There was no need to write a novel, no need to leave everything behind to start over, just enough courage to live truthfully each day. That was already something. When Caleb returned, he was surprised to find his mother at the computer, typing with a focused look. I thought you were resting, he said. Eleanor looked up, her eyes softly alight. I'm resting, but I'm also beginning. Caleb stepped inside, set down his canvas bag, and sat beside her. Anyway, beginning again with myself. Outside the window, the afternoon breeze swept across the porch. The last light of day streamed into the old room, brightening the space. Not with a new kind of light, but with a new perspective. From a woman who had chosen to live again. From exactly where she thought she'd been forgotten. The next morning, Eleanor woke up earlier than usual. Not because of an alarm clock and not because she had to prepare breakfast for anyone. Simply because she wanted to sit in the small window overlooking the valley and let the morning sunlight touch her face like a gentle greeting. Caleb was still asleep, his steady breathing drifting softly from the room next door. Eleanor poured herself a cup of herbal tea, wrapped herself in an old wool shawl, and opened the notebook she had left unfinished the night before. It was no longer a journal of sorrow, but a page of short notes, a list of things she wanted to do, not for anyone else, but just for herself. Buy watercolor paints. Call Emily, the old friend I once wrote to and never followed up. Plan to teach a small baking class in the fall. The list wasn't long, but each line was like a budding seed. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet beginning of a woman who had once forgotten who she was and was now listening again to the voice within. When Caleb woke up and came downstairs, he saw his mother, the woman who used to live quietly between forgotten meals and unanswered messages, sitting with a cup of tea, smiling. Not because someone told a joke, but because the simple peace of the morning was enough to soften her heart. I was thinking of driving you around the lake later. Would you like that? Eleanor looked at her son and gave a soft nod. Yes, but this time, I want to drive. Balaam smiled, a quiet smile, but full of understanding. He handed her the keys like a small ceremony, handing back the right to steer her own path. The car rolled down the narrow road that circled the lake. The summer breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves gently. Eleanor felt her hands on the steering wheel like a declaration. She didn't need to go fast, didn't need to know everything ahead. She just needed to know that she was choosing her own direction. On the way back, she stopped the car when she spotted a field of soft lavender wildflowers blooming by the roadside. Eleanor opened the door and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The scent of sunlight, of earth, and wildflowers blended together, simple but profoundly real. Caleb followed, and the two of them sat quietly in the grass, saying nothing, only watching. It wasn't an extraordinary moment, but it was a memory not easily forgotten. When they returned to the small house, Eleanor placed a bundle of wildflowers into a vase at the center of the dining table. In a kitchen once so familiar, it had become invisible. Something had changed, not the room, but the woman within it. Sometimes the journey back to yourself doesn't require storms or grand partings. All it takes is a quiet place, a person who listens, and a moment gentle enough to remind you, I'm still alive, still longing, and still worthy. Life doesn't always break with a loud noise. Sometimes it quietly slips by through the days when we lose ourselves in routines, in roles, in silences that were never named. Eleanor's story is not one of rebellion nor of running away. It is a quiet, courageous journey, a return inward to where the woman she once was still waits patiently for herself to arrive. If you've ever sat in your familiar kitchen and no longer recognized your reflection in the mirror, if you've ever felt exhausted from being fine for too long, that may be. It's time you found a new season for yourself, too. You don't have to go far. You just need to start with something small. It's an old phone call, a forgotten hobby, or a moment when you simply allow yourself to breathe deeply and fully. What do you think is the wildflower by the roadside in your life? Those simple things that may seem meaningless, but somehow awaken a long asleep part of your soul? Share with me. You might not be as alone on this journey as you think.